Buongiorno a tutti, sono Enrico Giovannini, Presidente dell'Istituto Nazionale di Statistica e mi è stato chiesto di moderare questo primo panel. In realtà mi sento molto a casa, essendo stato il Chief Statistician dell'Ocse fino al 2009 e quindi mi sento veramente tra amici. Io sto seguendo le istruzioni di Scognamiglio, quindi parlo in italiano, anche se avevamo detto che avrei dovuto parlare in inglese, ma insomma facciamo un po' e un po'. It's a great pleasure to be here in order to guide this panel of distinguished experts about one of the key issues of today's society. In fact, as the President just said, addressing the issue of job creation and employment is a moral obligation for all of us. I will start with just a few slides. Se posso avere le slide, per favore. Benissimo. This slide on the right-hand side shows in a nutshell the situation of employment and unemployment in Europe. In terms of absolute levels and in terms of employment rate, unemployment rate, and you can see how the increase in unemployment and the decrease of employment were very well linked to the economic cycle. Now we are in a situation where unemployment stopped to rise and is slightly reducing, and the employment is almost flat, but the real question is, will we be able to stimulate, to grow enough to recover all the million jobs that have been lost in Europe? In fact, we are now back to the 2006 level, more or less. And the slow recovery is underway, as I said, since mid-2010, but is still very far from covering the gap that the recession has created. On the other hand, there is a serious issue of inactivity. In fact, also the number of people who are not actively looking for jobs in our countries increased a lot. So here we are facing a big risk of social exclusion that is not necessarily recorded in unemployment rate statistics. The adjustment in the EU labor markets were quite different depending on the type of jobs. In fact, here you can see that the part-time workers' share in total employment increased during the crisis, and people with temporary contracts lost a lot of positions vis-à-vis the others, which means that the recession hit in most countries the most vulnerable people, and especially, as we will see in a few seconds, young people. In fact, if we ask ourselves who paid the toll of the crisis, we can clearly see that young people did. The young generations were really strongly affected by the crisis, and this is creating maybe, at least in some countries like Italy, less tense, less difficult situations for households because the jobs of parents were protected in a sense, but a lot of young people were obliged to go back to their families, and this is not good, of course, for their future development. So it's quite impressive how the young people suffered by this situation. And youth unemployment increased a lot is now in Europe around 21%. In Italy, we are around 30%. In Spain, as you know, is much higher. We didn't lose only young people, but among young people, we mainly lost jobs for those less educated, which of course are more difficult to be re-included in the labor market. These charts shows that education has a good payoff in terms of finding a job, but on the other hand, that people with secondary and lower education has been pushed out of the market. So these are just a few slides to give a framework where we are in Europe. But of course, we have to go beyond Europe, and I'm very pleased to have three distinguished panelists that will help us in understanding what's going on not only in Europe, but also in the rest of the OECD countries, in emerging countries, and also in the Eastern European countries. So I have the pleasure to introduce Stefano Scarpetta, Vice Director, Deputy Director of the Social and Labor Directorate of the OECD, Carlos Braga, Director of the World Bank for Europe, and Elisabeth Hagen, Executive Director of the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. They will cover different areas according to what I just said, but I don't want to take more time, and so I'm pleased to give the floor to Stefano Scarpetta. They will introduce the topic 10 minutes each, then we will have a second round of conversations, but beforehand I will give the floor to you for a few questions, and we will try to have an interactive panel. Stefano, you have the floor. Thank you.
Grazie Presidente Giovannini, Presidente Ramp, Dottor Ghizzoni, Dottor Scognamillo, Ambasciatore Oliva, cari colleghi. È un grande piacere per me partecipare a questa sessione del forum e vorrei ringraziare anche a nome del nostro segretario generale dell'Ocse, Angel Gurria, per l'opportunità che Unicredit ci ha dato di organizzare insieme questo evento, di poter partecipare alla discussione su un tema centrale che interessa tutti i paesi, l'Italia, i paesi dell'Ocse e direi tutti i paesi emergenti e in via di sviluppo. Anche io alternerò un po' l'italiano con l'inglese anche per favorire il dibattito con i nostri colleghi su questo podio. What I would like to do is basically in the first intervention to give you an overview of labor market developments in the OECD countries in particular during the economic downturn, but also in the first phases of the economic recovery. And basically what I would like to say can be summarized in four main points. The first, and we just have issued the latest projection in our economic outlook at the end of May, is that the economic recovery is firmly ground across all of the OECD countries, or most of the OECD countries, but growth is actually taking place at very different speeds across regions and countries. As we know, on the global economic growth is expected to be in the order of 4.25%, 4.75% in 2011, 2012, but it's going to be around 7% in the emerging economies, while only 2.25%, 2.75% in the OECD countries. So the first message is that actually the economic recovery is taking place at very different speeds across the board. And many of the advanced countries are actually growing at a pretty low pace. The second, perhaps more problematic, and which is really the focus of this panel, is that despite the fact that we are about 2 years into the economic recovery, we have not yet seen significant improvements in the labor market. There are wide differences across the board, but for the OECD as a whole, the unemployment rate in the last observation in May is around 8.1%, which is not that far from the peak that was reached at the end of 2009 on 8.8%. So certainly in terms of labor market conditions, we are not out of the crisis. We are still, to some extent, in the middle of it. And the interesting point is that during the economic downturn and in the early phases of the recovery, we have seen very large differences across the board in the way in which the labor market has adjusted. This is not new. We have seen that in previous economic downturn, but the extent of the difference across the board is quite surprising and interesting. In a number of European countries as well as Japan, we have seen a lot of adjustment taking place via the reduction in working time. Companies have managed to keep part of their workforce, while in other countries, a significant part of the adjustment has been in terms of job losses. So the crisis had a very different impact on the labor market in the downturn and also in the recovery, as you will see. The third point is that while during the crisis, the major concern for policymakers was how to try to reduce the pace of job losses, because we saw this significant increase in the pace of unemployment. I think the issues we are facing now is how we deal with a growing proportion of unemployed people who have been unemployed for more than a year, the long-term unemployed. As you will see in one of the slides I have, this proportion has increased sometimes dramatically. And we know all that well from previous economic downturn how risky it is for people to experience not just unemployment, but a long spell of unemployment.